Good afternoon, everyone. Librarian Danielle Bélanger here from the Cote-Saint-Luc Public Library, joining you virtually. Today, we have another great program for you. The library is thrilled to have the opportunity to host a third conversation with best-selling historical fiction author, Julia Kelly. Thank you very much, Julia, for taking the time to speak with me today, all the way from London, and to Natasha at Simon & Schuster for making this event possible. Thank you also to Andreas at Paragraph Bookstore for collaborating with us on this event. So if you are interested in purchasing a book through Paragraph Bookstore, you can contact the librarian or you can do so online. You can also put your name down for the library at the library for the book if you're a library member, The Lost English Girl by Julia Kelly. You won't be disappointed. So to begin with, I will share a condensed bio. Julia Kelly is the best-selling author of books of historical fiction and now also historical mystery about the extraordinary stories of the past. In addition to writing, she's been an Emmy-nominated producer, journalist, marketing professional, and for one summer, a tea waitress. Julia called Los Angeles, Iowa, and New York City home before settling in London. Readers can visit Julia Kelly Writes, WRITES.com to learn more about all of her books and sign up for her newsletters so they never miss a new release. Welcome back, Julia. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me for a third time. I feel like at some point we'll meet in person one day, but
yes,
it's wonderful to be able to join virtually.
Well, thank you so much. And congratulations on another beautifully written novel.
Thank you.
So before we even discuss your latest novel, The Lost English Girl, let's briefly speak about your bio. For those who missed it last time or the previous time one or time two, so it always intrigued me when I read in your bio, working as a tea waitress. So we will ask you one again to talk a little bit about that and maybe also let us know about some of your favorite tea spots in London.
Well, the working as a tea waitress was really a summer job between ending high school and going off to university. But I went and I served, I think it was 3 seatings of tea a day. It was high tea. So very different than the normal cup of tea that I would just make for myself in the kitchen here with the full, this place did the full finger sandwiches and scones and sweet as well. But I like to think that it was good training ground for ending up living in London. So, and in terms of good places for tea, London and Britain in general is just, the tea is fantastic no matter where you go. So, it all depends on the type of tea that you want and what you're looking for, because your standard cup of tea is very, very different from your high tea that you would go to, for instance, a hotel for. So, it really just depends on what it is that you're after. But I have some friends who loved going to Kensington Palace, and they have a tea room there in the Orangery. So I took them a few years ago, and we were able to go and do that, which was a lot of fun.
Very nice. And what's your favorite tea, Julia?
I'm a Yorkshire tea drinker. I'm very happy with a cup of Yorkshire Gold. So that's normally what I wake up with and what I'll usually have throughout the day as well.
Okay, very nice. This is the first novel you write while strictly working as a full-time writer. Can you tell us a little bit about this change and how you like it so far?
Well, it was funny. It was a much, much bigger change than I expected it to be. So just to give a little bit of context, for about 10 years, I had written books and also worked a day job at the same time. And it teaches you a very specific skill, which is being very, very good with your time management and figuring out little bits and pieces of time that you can use to write and edit novels. So I would, for instance, take a laptop with me to work and then sit in a cafeteria or sit somewhere away from my desk in order to do a little bit of work over over my lunch if I was able to grab a lunch. So, things like that, when you take away the day job, it's wonderful because it opens up all of this time to you, and it's this fantastic luxury of time. But it also meant that I had to sort of relearn everything that I had figured out for myself over the years. So all all of the sort of tips and tricks for cramming writing into a very small amount of time really didn't work in the same way anymore, because I now had my entire working day ahead of me every day. And so I had to figure out how to sort of restructure my whole writing life while also starting a brand new book, which was The Lost English Girl. And so it really was a challenge, much more so than I thought it would be. And it took me about 4 or 6 weeks to kind of start to get my feet under me again. But when I did, I found I really, really loved having the extra time to research, having the extra time to read and kind of plan in a way that I hadn't been able to for books before, because I just didn't have the time, unfortunately.
And are you still running?
I am still running, not as often as I was. I'm doing a bit of Pilates as well, trying to keep myself from getting injured again, because that has happened to me. So I do try to kind of balance things out. It's cold here, not nearly as cold as it is in some places, but in England it feels cold, and so I will admit I've been wimping out a little bit and not running as much as I should be. But the spring hopefully is coming soon, so it will warm up and give me a bit of motivation to get out there again.
And I read that before moving on from, having other jobs while you wrote at the same time, knowing this was going to be a big change, you kind of took some time to yourself to do a few things. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I got some good advice from a friend, an author named Lindsay Emery, and she had made a big change as well and had gone to writing full time after working in a job that required a lot of hours and a lot of time. And she gave me the advice that I should take a month or even more if I felt like I could afford the time, and just not do anything related to work. So, my day job would be behind me and my new full-time writing job would be ahead of me, and just to use the time to decompress. And her advice was great advice, because it meant that I was able to sort of deprogram a little bit and sort of the pace of the working day and the meetings. And this was, we had just come out of the 3rd lockdown here in the UK. And so things were starting to edge towards, being a bit more open, but by no means were things back to normal again. So I was still very much working from home at this job that had originally started as 5 days a week in the office, of course. So I needed, I think, a bit of a break and a bit of a barrier so that I wasn't kind of just immediately jumping into writing and not really thinking about how that was going to work. And even then I struggled a little bit to figure out how my writing day was going to work and how I was going to kind of be able to be a full-time writer in the day-to-day rather than the big dream of writing full time. So it was great advice. I read, I worked in my garden when I was living at my old flat. I saw some friends and family, went on a little holiday. So all of the lovely things that I like to do to decompress anyway. And then I felt much fresher when it came to actually starting up again and starting a new book.
Very good advice for anyone thinking of making the big change out there.
Thank you.
Congratulations on another brilliantly written novel that, among other things, tells the harrowing story of England's many evacuated children. I'm referring, of course, to The Lost English Girl, which I'm holding right here.
My copy here too.
Yes, very nice. So a big thank you once again to Simon & Schuster for sending me an advanced reader's copy of the book. So I will share a synopsis of the plot for those listening in today. Liverpool, 1935. Raised in a strict Catholic family, Viv Byrne knows what's expected of her. Marry a Catholic man from her working class neighborhood and have his children. However, when she finds herself pregnant after a fling with Joshua Levinson, a Jewish man with dreams of becoming a famous jazz musician, Viv knows that a swift wedding is the only answer. Her only solace is that marrying Joshua will mean escaping her strict mother's scrutiny. But when Joshua makes a life-changing choice on their wedding day, Viv is forced once again into the arms of her disapproving family. 5 years later, and on the eve of World War II, Viv is faced with the impossible choice to evacuate her young daughter, Maggie, to the countryside estate of the affluent Thompson family. In New York City, Joshua gives up his failing musical career to serve in the Royal Air Force, fight for his country, and try to piece together his feelings about the family, wife, and daughter he left behind at 18. However, tragedy strikes when Viv learns that the countryside safe haven she sent her daughter to wasn't immune from the horrors of war. It is only years later, with Joshua's help, that Viv learns the secrets of their shared past and what it will take to put a family back together. Julia, could you please discuss what you meant exactly when you said the Lost English Girl was inspired by family stories and legends?
So this is a bit of a funny one, because when I think when you say that something is inspired by a family story, often people think you are writing the story of your family, and that's not the case in this case. What I did instead was, there's this family story, and everybody involved in it has long since passed away. So we really don't know much about the story, except that there was my relative, a young Catholic girl who became pregnant out of wedlock. Her boyfriend, or the boy, we don't know anything about their relationship, so we don't know how long this relationship had been going on for. But he was Jewish, and the idea of an interfaith marriage was really frowned upon at this time. But the idea of having an illegitimate child was even more so. And so what happened was, they were brought together and they were married. And then on the same day they were married, they were separated. And as far as we know, they never saw each other again. And so that, of course, as an author, just leaves you, as anybody really, just leaves you with so many questions about who these people were, how he felt about never seeing his child, how she felt about him not being there and being her husband really only in name, whether they were in love. There's just so many things to kind of dig into and think about. And because there's nobody to answer those questions, I thought, well, what if I tried to put two characters into this situation and explore what happens after that? So the book opens with that marriage and the separation on the wedding day, but there's a whole book and a whole story and, life to live beyond that. And I really wanted to explore that story from both of those characters' perspectives. So we get both Viv's perspective and Joshua's perspective, as well as a little bit from their daughter, Maggie, as well. And it was really important to me to, like I said, write a novel that is, truly about fictional characters, but to have that seed of inspiration in the beginning of that book.
In this novel, you explore the Byrne family and what it means to be Catholic. We also get to know the Levinsons and how Judaism affects and influences their daily lives. When the two families first cross paths, it feels like one faux pas after the other, with Viv's mother being the biggest critic of all. Can you please tell us how you went about researching interfaith marriages in Liverpool in the 1930s and how these were viewed so poorly, or it seems?
Right. Well, it's really interesting. So I started writing this book and I realized very quickly I had a real responsibility to try to represent these characters in the world that they lived in, their faith and their culture, as accurately as I could. And, it's always difficult talking about representing a single character accurately when everybody's experience is so different, even within a faith or even within a culture. But I was trying to make it feel authentic. And so I had the advantage of, despite not being religious myself, having the perspective of somebody who grew up in that Catholic Liverpool, working class Liverpool community in my mother and my relatives. And so I was able to ask a lot of questions about what that world was like and how centered around a tight-knit community that was really driven by the church and by the values that their priest would have set before them, at Mass every Sunday, and how important the priest's role was in the family as well. I have a scene where the priest visits the household and it's a big deal. The good china comes out, the sitting room that's only used for these visits gets used. And so I really wanted to convey that. And then just in the same way, feeling that sense of responsibility, I wanted to figure out, how do I portray a Jewish family and a Jewish character living in Liverpool during this time, again, without being first of all, not being from the 1930s, but also not having that as my background in my religion. And so I read a lot, which is always a good place to start, I think. But I also had the help of two really wonderful academics who were incredibly generous with their time. One is Dr. Tony Kushner and one is Dr. Teresa Ward. And they were really instrumental in giving me a sense of what the Jewish experience might have been in Liverpool at the time, as opposed to some communities where there would have been sort of a grouping together of people and sort of a neighborhood that was known as being a Jewish neighborhood. Liverpool was much more interdispersed than that. So you had people living next to each other. One family might have been Catholic, one might have been Jewish. So you would have had a lot of interactions, but that wouldn't necessarily have always made people empathetic towards each other, or would have meant that there's no anti-Semitism. That is something that my characters do experience and talk about on the page. But one of the things that was also really significant was talking about interfaith marriage. And it was really interesting talking to those two academics, because they said, we have absolutely found instances of this, and everybody's family would have been different about how they would have handled that. Some families would have been more accepting, some would have eventually come round once the marriage had happened, and some it would have broken the family apart completely. And so I had to make a decision about what kind of family were the Levinsons going to be. And they are, it's not a massive spoiler because, the book's sprawls out from this quite a ways, but they are more accepting. And there is a relationship that they want to develop there with Viv, and with her daughter as well. And so it was really helpful having their perspective. And then of course, also every time you are writing that character that you don't have that experience of, it is so helpful to have a sensitivity reader, making sure that you're not missing any major points, making sure that you're not accidentally, inadvertently saying something offensive or something that wouldn't ring true for that character. And so I had a wonderful sensitivity reader also helping me make sure that I was describing language and describing practices and customs correctly on the Jewish side. And then my mother did a read for me as well, and caught things that I was talking about that didn't quite ring true for the Catholic side as well. So I owe a huge debt of gratitude to all of those people.
And how do you go about finding someone to do a sensitivity read? Because this comes up more now than it used to. We've heard it from a few different authors. Do you just put an ad out, seek for someone's help on this?
I've heard a lot of different people taking a lot of different approaches, and my mother being the exception, I feel very strongly about paying for people's hard work if they are doing that work for me. I did have one reader who very kindly, her name's Susan, and she may actually be watching right now, who did on the initial pass of the book, before major changes were made. She did read it. She did offer me some feedback. Her husband also offered me some feedback, especially with the spelling of some Hebrew phrases in the book. So that was absolutely invaluable. And then I actually hired my former editor, whose name is Marla, and she does this now as part of this editing services that she offers. One of the things that she has expertise in is being a sensitivity reader around Jewish characters. And so that was an absolute by chance, the right person at the right point in my life popping up. And I literally was sitting there in bed reading and thought, oh, I should ask if Marla would be willing to do it. And so, I was very, very happy to have both Susan and Marla so willing and generous with their time. And then, of course, asking my poor mother to do that as well. She was very willing to, but I really appreciated it.
Well, thank you, Julia. I'm sure people that are tuned in were curious, and Susan is here, and she does say hello. And she says she was honored to be part of your process.
Oh, well, I was so happy for her to be a part of that process. It was so appreciated, and you'll see her in the acknowledgements.
Okay. Viv faces constant criticism due to her Catholic upbringing, and Joshua faces ongoing discrimination merely because he is Jewish. Do you think this helped these two understand and empathize with each other a little better over time, over the course of this novel?
I hope it does. I think when they initially, because there are some flashback scenes where we see their relationship developing when they first meet each other. And I think that initial attraction is much more the fact that, you have two people who have big dreams of doing something different. And in Viv's case, it's, she doesn't entirely know how to articulate what something is, but she just knows that she wants to live a little bit of life that is not exactly what has been, told to her for, her entire life, which is that she's going to get married to somebody who lives in her community, who probably goes to her church or a neighboring church. And she's going to live the same life that her mother and her sister and all the women around her have had. And in Joshua's case, he has ambitions. He wants to be a musician, and his family is not exactly discouraging, but not encouraging either. They want him to be very practical. They want him to have the backup plan of going into the family business, which is tailoring. And they want him to kind of be satisfied with his music career as it is, which is kind of playing Friday and Saturday gigs. At Liverpool had these incredible ballrooms that unfortunately most of them don't exist anymore. But they were places where, big bands would play and people would dance, and it was a really big deal. It had a really vibrant scene. And so he's a part of that, but he thinks, I have the talent, I can do more than this. And so he really wants to get to New York. Ultimately, that's his dream, is to be a working musician and to hopefully, find some fame and fortune. But I think that that's the initial attraction between the two of them. And then I think as the book goes on, there's maybe an understanding that life hasn't exactly worked out the way that they thought it was going to on both sides. And I think that does bring a little bit of empathy between the two of them, and maybe a willingness to kind of view each other slightly differently than they maybe initially start the book out seeing each other.
Thank you. So Susan did want to say that she loved the book, and thank you very much for your kind words to her. So you do a beautiful job of describing the ballroom where they go on a very nice date, Viv and Joshua. Can you tell us about how you were able to so vividly describe this? Were you able to visit a beautiful ballroom in Liverpool?
So unfortunately, I couldn't visit, but one of the great things about a city like Liverpool, where there's a really strong sense of identity. People from Liverpool are from Liverpool. They are very proud of that, and rightly so. My family is from Liverpool, and I'm proud of that. And you can tell from my accent, I'm not from there. So, I think there is a real sense that this is a city that has a story that is worth telling and a story that's worth preserving. So Liverpool Echo and several other publications and websites have really done a great job of photographing these old ballrooms. Some of them, unfortunately, have been demolished. Some of them have been repurposed, in some cases, concert spaces or other uses. But a lot of them that those photographs do show, the gold leafed details and the way that it looked. And I was actually able to also find some information about the ballrooms from the 1930s in a book that was specifically about sort of Liverpool's ballrooms. I think it was a very small press history, but it was wonderful because it gave a sense of, what it was like to get dressed up, what it was like in terms of the admission fee, where you would go, when you would go, kind of what was deemed respectable, what was maybe a less respectable place. So, Viv's a young woman who lives in a pretty strict household. And so it was very important that she was, seen to be doing something respectable in the eyes of her parents. And so, so that was a really fun, a little bit of Liverpudlian history that I was able to hopefully carry on through the book and maybe educate some readers about who didn't know about it.
Yes. And you were researching ballrooms as well when you wrote your previous novel, historical fiction,
Yes.
The Last Dance of the Debutante. So a little bit of an offshoot.
Little bits and pieces.
In terms of writing style, this book alternates from different points of view and centers on both Viv and Joshua's lives and how they ultimately reunite to find their evacuated daughter Maggie after a stream of mishaps. You also include heartfelt letters Joshua writes to his family. Did you come across letters of this sort during your research for this novel?
Unfortunately, I didn't. The first-hand accounts that I had were much more oral history. So there's a wonderful website, and I always bungle the name, so hopefully I can get this right. I believe it's called The People's World War II. And it was a project by the BBC to try to preserve as many of these oral histories as possible from people who lived during the war and experienced it. So everyone from, children to people who fought to, women who were in the auxiliary services or who stayed home, were air raid wardens. So it's this incredible database of information. And I always start there whenever I start writing a book. And I just start kind of madly typing in whatever it is that I think might be useful. So for instance, when it comes to somebody in the RAF, which is what Joshua ends up joining, the branch of service he ends up joining. So I started reading all sorts of things about, men who were in the RAF and trying to get a sense of, what was the experience like, where were they stationed? And once I kind of narrowed down some of those details, I could get a bit more specific. So he is trained in Blackpool. And one of the things that kept coming up whenever I found information about Blackpool was how cold it was on their training runs, the wind coming off of the water and how dreary it was when it was not summer. So getting to pepper little bits and pieces of information in through that was really helpful. But unfortunately, letters weren't really something I had as much access to. So maybe one day.
Okay, no problem. There's a turning point in the novel when Viv decides she's going to find a better way to live than the constant work and put downs of her overbearing mother. I have to say it, I'm sorry. She decides she will find work and keep some of her wages to make a better, healthier life for herself and Maggie to share. She ends up finding work as a postie. Can you tell us a bit more about this period in time when women stepped in to deliver the mail?
Absolutely. So, the post office was one of those areas where women really took over a lot of jobs because the idea was that if women were delivering the post or in the sorting rooms or working in the delivery vans, driving delivery vans, then a man who normally would have held that job could go off to war and fight. And so there was a call for women across a lot of different industries to step up and take these jobs. And with Viv in particular, she has, before the book starts, she had been in a sorting room of one of the post office delivery offices. And she had to give the job up when she got married because the general post office, as it was called then, had a marriage ban. So when a girl got married, she was no longer eligible to work. The idea was that she would be at home, taking care of the household, taking care of the kids, and, a job just wasn't going to be suitable for her anymore. So through some finagling, I get her a job at the post office again, but this time, instead of being in the sorting room, she's actually out delivering the mail. And so she finds a sort of a freedom, not just through having access to wages and earning money again, but also through actually being literally out on her bike, riding up and down the streets of her route and sort of getting to know different people. And her world starts opening up again after being very closed off for a very long time.
Just as in your previous novel, some readers may have difficulty bearing with some of the more over-the-top personalities you depict, i.e. Viv's mother. How do you go about balancing out the personalities and making sure each feels authentic?
Well, one of the things that a woman like Viv's mother is a difficult character because I think, you want to convey a sense that she is the villain of the book in many ways, but that what she's doing is not without reason. And so you might disagree with it, and I disagree with it, but she is a product of her time and her place. And she is a woman who believes very much that it is important that her family is deemed to be respectable and is following the teachings of the Catholic Church and the teachings of her family priest, and that gossip and sin and all of these things are really to be avoided. And I think in her own strange way, she thinks that she's trying to protect her daughter. And she thinks that by acting in this way and demanding this sort of behavior from her daughter, that she is protecting Viv and keeping her from the alternative, which in her case, in her family background, there is a sister who's little spoken about, but the context is that the sister has gotten pregnant out of wedlock, and it's essentially ruined her life. And so, she is a tricky character, because I think you want to make it very clear that this is not something that ultimately this main character, Viv, is going to tolerate for the entirety of the book. But at the same time, it's important that people understand that, Viv's mother is not doing the things that she does just to be mean, if that makes sense. She has a reason why she's doing these things. And again, we may not agree with it, and I wholeheartedly do not agree with it. But I think it's always best when that motivation from a villain or an antagonist comes from a place of that's really grounded in what's important to them.
I'll be curious to hear, once I know a few people at work or in the community, in our community, who've read the book, how they feel about Viv's mother. I can understand where she's coming from, and even though it was difficult dealing with her relationship with Viv, I just broke my heart when it came to extending it to Maggie.
Absolutely.
So that's
Absolutely.
what was hardest to deal with for me, but I'm sure every reader will have a different opinion. And
I completely agree.
Sometimes you can't gloss over people and their
Yeah, and I think, her
views.
mother does some really unforgivable things. And I think, one of the things that is always interesting to me is trying to write characters who have some sense of, flaws with them, even the main characters who you're really supposed to root for and you're supposed to really like. Viv makes some decisions and says some things and does some things that, she needs to grow up a bit, and she needs to learn sort of what it is that's actually important to her. Joshua as well, maybe more obviously, based on kind of what happens at the very beginning of the book. Joshua has a lot of growing to do. But my hope is that as Joshua grows and changes, that readers become more and more sympathetic with him, and they really can see him go through a whole character arc that brings him to a completely different place.
I think definitely it's a little bit more difficult with the other men in the story to relate to them or empathize, because they don't feel as though they grow as much as Joshua. But Joshua, I think that your readers will empathize with, because, everybody makes mistakes, but he does try to grow. He does try to change. He evolves throughout the novel. So I commend you on making Joshua an interesting character.
Thank you. Thank you. That's what you want, is an interesting character.
In this book, you do once again tackle the theme of a woman's role in society, whether through Mrs. Byrne or Edith, Viv, Mrs. Thompson or Anne, Mrs. Levinson, Rebecca, Kate, and later in the novel, even Maggie herself. Whose character did you enjoy writing the most, and why?
I have a real soft spot for Mrs. Levinson. She is a secondary character. She's Joshua's mother. But both she and Rebecca, Joshua's sister, I think are different women who are doing different things in the book, but I have a lot of compassion for both of them. And I think ultimately they are trying to bring elements of, I'm trying to be very careful about spoilers, but bring elements of their family back together, and kind of repair damage that's been done. So I really enjoyed writing both of them and getting to explore that family dynamic, because I think it's a very warm family, but again, one that has flaws as well, and characters who are hesitant about certain things and need to grow and need to change. I always enjoy writing my female main characters. One of the great joys of writing about women during this period of time is learning along with, I hope, learning along with the reader, and discovering the stories about women that you don't necessarily hear in the day-to-day. I was speaking to somebody a few days ago who said, people really think sometimes mistakenly that, World War II is a man's story and it's about men, and it's not, because in order for the fighting and the conflict and the war that happened to go on, it needed the work of women in order to not only continue on with things on the home front in every country that was involved, but also, women played an incredibly important role in the auxiliary services. They were, nurses and volunteers and air raid wardens. They worked in factories. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And it's such a rich area as an author because it is still so untapped, even though there are a lot of stories about World War II that are coming out these days. I always get excited whenever I find books about things that I know nothing about, women's stories who I've never heard of before. And that to me is really exciting. And one of the things, just as an example of that, this is a book ultimately that's about the evacuation of children from their homes in urban centers out to the countryside. And I hadn't really seen an evacuated child in Britain's story for a while. And I thought, oh, this is going to be an interesting thing to explore. And at the same time, Patty Callahan Henry with the Book of Flora Lee, and Hazel Gaynor with The Last Lifeboat, and I think actually Kristen Harmel with The Paris Orphan, I think the book is called. We're all doing books that are related to evacuation of children, and they are wildly different from each other. And I think that's really exciting. So, Hazel's book, which I have on my nightstand right now, deals with the evacuation of children out of the country. Patty's deals with the evacuation of children and the aftermath of what happened after the war. And I'm telling a very different story than those two. And so I think that's really exciting when you can find those different elements all within sort of one publishing year and all within kind of one umbrella subject area. So there's lots of fresh stories still to tell.
And you touched upon this also in The Last Garden of England. We also, we have this theme of women stepping in unconventional roles. So this is not the first time you tackle.
No, I love that subject. And, I did it in the Light Over London, and I talked a little bit about it in The Whispers of War. So it's definitely something that I'm drawn to, and an element that I really enjoy writing about.
I'm sorry, just a moment. I saw something else. This is from Susan. Having read the book, I don't want to give spoilers, but would you ever revisit these characters and expand on their lives post-war? We know a bit, but I would love to read more details about how their experiences after the war develops.
I would never say never, because you never know. There are absolutely stories to tell about really all the characters in the books that I've written, and things that could potentially happen. But I think for now, I probably have told the story that I want to tell, and we'll see whether there's a possibility of reviving that at some point. One thing that I do like to do occasionally is thread in little Easter eggs from book to book. And so I didn't have as many opportunities to do that with this book. But in the past, especially the books set in London, I've been able to have people pop up, and it's literally sometimes just a name mention or the mention of a location that, unless you're somebody who's read my books before, you would have no idea. But if you have read them, my hope is you go, oh my gosh, it's kind of a whole cinematic world that all lives together. So there might be some opportunities to dot certain things through in future books, but I wouldn't rule it out, but I wouldn't say it's coming anytime soon.
And speaking of Easter eggs spread around here and there are many nods to your love of jazz music in this novel. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, it was really fun to thread through a little bit of jazz with this book, with Joshua being a saxophone player. I lived in New York for about 9 years, and I just love the history of New York and its jazz scene. It was such a vibrant, incredible place for music during this period of time. And so Joshua actually is a working musician. He's sort of a regular fill-in in some cases for several bands on Swing Street, which was 52nd Street in Midtown Manhattan. And there were just club after club after club. And it's just a small little line, but I wrote in that he sort of walks away from the club that he's played in one night, and he can kind of hear the music spilling out into the street from all these different places. And that absolutely would have happened because there were just so many different locations where people were listening to really good jazz and dancing to really good jazz. Pretty much everybody who was anybody in the music world during that era rattled through at some point, or did a special appearance or a guest stand, or was part of the house band. So I loved that. And I also tried to pop in some favorite songs. So there's some references to like St. Louis blues and Body and Soul and a couple of other jazz pieces that I really love.
Very nice. So one more little comment from Susan. She says, just a second, that she is reading Kristen's book right now, and it is amazing. And Patty's was incredible, and she cannot wait to add Hazel's to her shelf. I'm so interested in the plight of children who were evacuated during the war, and you and all of these authors deal with the subject in very different ways. So that's exciting to be able to see this subject, but from different point of views and maybe different perspectives, different cities.
Definitely.
So on this note, can you tell us a little bit more about one of the central themes of the novel, Operation Pied Piper? I don't want to say it wrong.
Yes. So Operation Pied Piper was the mass evacuation of children, mothers and infants, and vulnerable people from places that they thought were high risk in terms of potentially being bombed during the war. And I actually, interestingly, they started these evacuations before war was declared. So it was announced that people would start moving through evacuation trains. Children would start moving to the countryside where they were supposed to be kept safe. I believe the announcement came through on the last day of August, and the trains started leaving stations on the 1st of September. Germany invades Poland on the 1st of September, and then war is actually declared on the 3rd of September. So this mass evacuation of 1.5 million people is underway when war actually is officially declared. So that is going on, and that's what Viv's sister Kate's family is dealing with. She has 3 children who are all of school children age. They all go with their classes to rural northern Wales, excuse me, where they're all taken care of by foster families. And then in Viv's case, Maggie is sent away via a private adoption, which accounted for, they think, another potentially 2 million evacuations. And in Maggie's case, it's because she was too young to be in school yet. So a placement was found through the family priest, through the church, and she goes and lives with the Thompsons. That is so many people who are moving in this mass evacuation, moving around Britain. And of course, there were different waves of evacuation because some people came home and then left again when the bombings in the Blitz in London. Liverpool had its own Blitz. Coventry was really heavily bombed. Glasgow was bombed. All the coastal cities were bombed because they were strategic sites. And so the government was right that, people would need to be protected in some way or another because there was the possibility of air raid strikes. But I think it was probably incredibly traumatizing for children and parents, and incredibly difficult to make that decision to send, in some cases, children as young as 5 years old away on these trains. So I think it's sort of the central kind of dilemma of the book of, could you send your child away knowing that you might not see them during this war, but could you keep them with you knowing that keeping them with you in the city you're in could lead to, incredible danger for them? And that's what Viv is facing.
Okay, sorry, Julia. I think we lost you for just a moment, but you are back.
Am I back now? Okay, excellent.
I can see you. Hopefully everyone else can as well. Doing the right thing and what is expected of you is what Lily faces at the beginning of your previous historical fiction novel that we discussed last time we spoke, The Last Dance of the Debutante. And similarly, Viv is also faced with this premise, albeit in very different circumstances. Did you realize both opened on a similar journey for your lead character?
I think that one of the reasons that the war is so interesting to me, and actually it sounds strange to say, but the end of the debutantes in 1958, in terms of the court presentations stop, the debutantes officially are no longer a thing after 1958. I think those are really interesting because in both cases you have longstanding traditions or expected roles for women that are changing. So the war brings about that change through the need for women to support the war effort. And in the case of the debutantes, it is the palace deciding that it's going to move away from this very traditional, old-fashioned way of doing things and sort of usher in modernity in a way. And I think ironically, there is a through line there, even though they could not be more different on the surface, those two subjects. But I really love putting characters in these moments of societal change. And in some cases, it's conflict with the war. And in some cases, it's, us with the benefit of hindsight, knowing that 1958 is not that far off from the swinging 60s. It's not that far off from the sexual revolution and women entering the workforce in large numbers. And so, getting a chance to explore these moments of change, I think, can be really exciting as an author because they can mirror the changes that your characters are going through. And in some cases, they can prompt those changes as well. And I think with Viv and with Lily, the opening up of their worlds and the learning more about what is around them and what is possible and potential for themselves really kind of sets them off on this journey. And so in some ways, there are a lot of parallels there, even though the stories themselves couldn't be more different.
So on a completely different topic, I read somewhere that you wrote coming in at over 150,000 words.
Oh, yes.
It was too long and filled with story bloat. So the question is, how did you fix this problem? 150,000 words, I can't even conceptualize this.
So I looked it up. I think this book ended up being about 110,000 words, and that translates to about 400 pages printed in book form. So if you can imagine even more than that, it was quite long. And so the short answer is I just chopped off the last 2/3 of it and threw it away and rewrote it. Sometimes different books need different things. And I always feel a little silly acting as though, books are like people and, or books are temperamental or something like that, because it's just words on a page, right? But it is really true that different stories sometimes can set out different challenges for you. And the challenge with this one was that I was trying to find the story, but I wasn't quite getting there. And so I was writing around it a lot. I was going off on different tangents and it just wasn't working, but I didn't really know what wasn't working about it. So I finished it and I sent it to my agent. I sent it to my editor. And then I kind of sat back and I finished it before Christmas. And so I was able to take a bit of a break. And then I started to think about it and I got feedback from my editor and my agent that sort of, they sort of started asking some questions and pointing out some things that weren't quite working. And one of the things that my agent actually said was, I had this big time jump. So I went from 1941 all the way to 1961. So 20 years had passed and it just didn't work. And something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And she said, I think you need to make the time jump shorter. How do you feel about the end of the war? And I went, oh, yeah, no problem. So I'll just change this, and this. I'll rewrite this. And I think it's going to be great. And she was like, oh, okay. You see, sometimes when you just know it's wrong, it's better to in my experience, it's better to throw it out, to rip the Band-Aid off, to really do the painful thing rather than kind of like trying to fix all these little things that aren't working. And you still know, like, ultimately there is a fundamental flaw at the heart of this book. And I'm so glad that I did, because it really unlocked everything that needed to change about the book. And I'm so proud of how it ended up, and so proud of the direction that it went in. And I'm so glad that I didn't try to stick with this thing that was not working. So if anybody is an aspiring author, or an established author and is going through an editing process that feels really painful, it's a lot of work, but sometimes it's really worth it.
We heard this from some other authors this year when we hosted Armando Lucas Correa for the Night Travelers. He was saying that his book originally was much, much longer, that he had to cut a lot down as well. Like you, he worked as a journalist, so he was able to do this and not, take it too personally that some of the material had to just go.
It's a good training ground, really, having that experience of somebody critiquing your work as part of your job every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And it does teach you to be philosophical sometimes about somebody saying, this isn't working, and I think this is why. And you say, okay, I agree with you. So here's what we're going to do to fix it.
So I would like to open up questions to the audience. For anyone who has a question for Julia, please put it in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will ask Julia. And what I was going to ask you, well, you mentioned that the timeline was longer in the original draft. Like Susan mentioned, I was kind of curious, what if we had a closer look at specifically Mrs. Thompson, because I found her an interesting character. Like, who is Mrs. Thompson? Does it ever happen that your mind wonders if you were to create a novel out of one of these side characters, or secondary characters?
I absolutely have had that thought about several characters in several books, or continuing on somebody's character as well. I think the most requested one I have is interestingly, it's Hazel from The Whispers of War, which I know we haven't talked about, but she has a big moment at the end of that book, changes a lot of things about her life. And a couple of people have been like, but what happens then? Like, what happens next? Because that book takes place much more at the beginning of the war. She has a lot of the war still to go through and things like that. So I've toyed with the idea of maybe writing some short stories or something like that, but I haven't landed on sort of a novel length idea for any of these characters. But I do think it would be fascinating to kind of look at some of the characters who are less sympathetic and giving them their own story and really expanding on why they are the way that they are. I love the author Lauren Willig's work, and I have been reading her since she was doing the Pink Carnation series. And she had this character who I want to say was Mary. And I'm going to mess up the name of the book as well, but I think it's the fourth book. It's got a red cover, and she is the main character in that book, and she is the antagonist through the books that come before it. She is the, kind of not fully villainous, but she's not exactly, a walk in the park when it comes to a character. And I loved that book because I felt like I really got to know why it was she was the way she was, and really found her to be deeply sympathetic by the end of it. And I thought that was such an achievement, really turning you around from, you've established these 3 books that you do not like this character for good reason. And then to turn around and give her her own book, and suddenly you sit there and you think, oh, well, now I understand her. And now, I still might not agree with what she does, but I kind of am rooting for her. I thought that was a real achievement as an author. So I should tell Lauren that one day.
I'm sure she'd be happy to hear that. Okay, so I'm going to wait a couple more minutes to see if anything comes in the chat. In the meantime, I will ask you, what surprised you most when researching this novel?
What surprised me most? I think a lot of the things that I learned around Operation Pied Piper, I sort of knew a bit about the evacuations, but I didn't understand the scale of it, and I didn't understand how what an incredible undertaking it was, but also how incredibly disruptive it was to people's lives, and how people struggled. There's a wonderful book called When the Children Came Home by Juliet Summers. It's a nonfiction book. It's a history of the return of these children to their families after the war. And in some cases, some children had really wonderful experiences with their foster families, some didn't. Some had really wonderful experiences being reunited with their families, some didn't. And understanding that, that experience, there's no sort of monolith with these evacuated children. Everybody has their own story. Everybody's story is unique and different. And it affected them in different ways. I think that really surprised me. I had never really considered what that might have been like for people, and for that to be so widespread, I think is really incredible and really sobering when you sit down and think about it.
Yeah, it's easy to imagine why you would have to go through this and why you would have to put your child on this route to ensure your child's safety, but it's difficult to understand, I'm sure, for the children. It must have been, especially when they're so young, some of them, why am I being sent away? Why, I'm sure some of them didn't understand that it was for their safety. Did the parents even have the time to explain that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that was a theme that definitely came up over and over again in researching this, was people who were very young as children really not understanding why they were being sent away. So in some cases thinking they'd done something wrong, which I think is in some ways the most tragic, because ironically their parents were trying to keep them safe and do the right thing. But, explaining that to a 5-year-old is so difficult. And so I think, again, different people had different experiences, not all negative, but I think it's much more nuanced than I expected it to be.
I also really enjoyed the way you wrote about the air sirens and how families, Maggie's, kind of quote unquote adopted family in the countryside, prepared for these, and how they prepared in Liverpool for these. So how did you go about researching that aspect?
Well, when bombings are a reality and something that people are preparing for, it comes up a lot. And so, talk about, the oral histories and different things that I'd read in the past. That's sort of something that I was aware of previously. And so, I wanted to give a sense that, the Thompsons are living in the countryside, and they're living a very affluent life in the countryside, and their experience would be slightly different than Viv and her family's experience living in this working class neighborhood of Walton, and sheltering there. And so trying to bring out some of those differences, trying to really get a sense of how terrifying this would have been, especially in Liverpool, where bombs absolutely were falling. And I went to the Liverpool Central Library search room and looked at photographs of bomb damage. And, they literally got evidence that was taken the day after of, this street was bombed at this corner, and you can see it's just rubble. And in some places, it just looks like a moonscape. And so trying to convey a sense that, this was very real for people, and it was terrifying, and different people reacted in different ways. That was one of the things that I wanted to try to really put into this book, with a sense of, the sirens and the bombing and what people would have done in these shelters and how they would have felt about needing to shelter in the first place.
So one of the characters in the book, well, I don't want to say it's a character, quote unquote, but you almost feel like maybe it's a character, is Liverpool itself. I think the reader can feel that you have a tug or a pull, something in your heart that's warm towards this city. Can you tell us a bit about your family connection specifically to Liverpool?
Well, I think it's one of those places that, unfortunately, as wonderful as the recent history is, a lot of people just think of the Beatles and, Liverpool, the football club. it has such a rich history. It is a major port town, and it was an even bigger port during the 1930s and 1940s, which means you have a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life and a lot of different places all coming together because of the shipping industry and other industry that was happening there as well. So, you know, it's a place that I love visiting, and I have loved visiting. I love the people. I love the accent. I love the, you know, the culture and the history and the sense of pride about the city. But I really wanted to make it feel like Liverpool was a necessary part of the book. You know, you can't pick this book up and drop it in Edinburgh or London or, you know, Cardiff or any of these other places, because part of who these people are is they are Liverpudlians, and that's a strong sense of identity. So I was able to go up and do some on the ground research, which was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. And I talked yesterday on my lunch party with my sister about how one of the things I had forgotten was how cold Liverpool in January is, which is when I was there. And so I set a scene in Liverpool in January outside, and she said, "Oh yeah, because you feel the wind come off of up the Mersey, off the Atlantic. You can hear the gulls. Like, there are certain things that to me are just very emblematic of just being in the city." And so I wanted to try to get those right. I wanted to try to get the neighborhoods correct, and look at street maps and get a sense of, distances and location. So I'm glad that comes through, because
Yes.
I really wanted it to be, in some ways, a bit of a love letter to my mother's hometown.
Definitely that comes across, Julia. So the last thing I will ask you, because no one else is, I think people are shy to ask you questions right now, but I will ask you, for those who are still listening but afraid to ask a question. Can you tell us a little bit about your next project?
Yes, so I can talk about one that I can talk about and one that I can't talk about. So the
Okay.
one I can't talk about is short and sweet. I am working on a book that is slated to come out 2024, but it's literally so new that I'm still writing it right now. So hopefully there will be lots of things to reveal. And I have a newsletter that I send to readers, and I kind of start to talk a little bit about what I'm writing about early on in that newsletter. So you can sign up for that on my website. But I also have the first mystery novel I've written coming out in October. So it's called A Traitor in Whitehall, and it's the start of my Evelyn Redfern mystery series. And it is set in World War II, but kind of a bit of a different spin. I have an amateur sleuth named Evelyn Redfern. It's written in first person. It's very voicey. Evelyn is a great lover of detective fiction, and she finds herself being recruited to be a typist in Churchill's cabinet war rooms. And very early on in her stint in the cabinet war rooms, somebody is murdered, and she takes it upon herself because she thinks that the people investigating it are incompetent and she doesn't trust them. She takes it upon herself to figure out who is the killer and what is going on in sort of this place of very important military and government power. So that's a really fun one that I loved writing. So I will get a chance to do that soon, hopefully.
So sounds very exciting. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us a little bit more about The Lost English Girl. It's a great book. Don't forget to put your name down for it. And thank you again, Julia. Have a great rest of your evening for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Julia.